Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas that shape and protect our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo. Welcome to today's episode. Thrilled to include two luminaries in the cyber field. We're changing the format a little bit here. Firstly, welcoming Ellen Nakashima, who I can tell you when she calls, people hold their breath, and for good reason, because she's broken so many stories and has also covered so many stories that are instrumental to our national security field. Ellen is at the Washington Post and has been writing on cyber and much more for a number of years. And then Dmitri Alperovitch, who everyone knows in the cyber field. He is the founder of CrowdStrike. I think you IPO'd, 4 or 5 years ago, and has been a prominent voice on cyber issues, and I think a very important and sobering voice. Really thrilled to have you both here. This is a little bit of a different format than we've had in the past, but you both cut your teeth in the cyber field. But you both also expanded your horizons quite dramatically, and I think have a healthy dose of skepticism around some of the assumptions that the cyber field more or less has. And I'd like to start with that and sort of get your initial thoughts. So, Dmitri, Ellen?
Well, Frank, thanks for having us on here, and you're right. It's a pleasure to be on with Dmitri, with whom I feel like I came up in the field those many years ago.
We're not that old.
It was 5 years. But I think when you say skepticism, yes, it's also just a sense of wanting to put things into perspective. I think when I first started, for instance, there was a sense amongst the practitioners that there wasn't enough awareness in the general public, much less in the government and the general public, about the threats and the potential harm that could come from not paying enough attention to cyber defense, cyber security. And so there was this sense that we need to get more people aware, make the C-suite, the executives in companies more aware to the threats in their systems, because after all, so much of the critical systems attack surface are in the private sector. And then maybe over time, there was a little bit of an overcorrection to getting people aware. So there was somewhat of sometimes a tendency, I think, amongst some in the policy world, the government, in the effort to try to get people to pay attention, they might have hyped the language they used a little bit. And so I remember my mother-in-law would always, when I had a story about a cyber incident or a cyber threat, she would say, "Oh, Ellen, how do I have to worry?" And I would say, "Calm down, Mom." But it's not to say that this isn't a serious and sobering threat, and something we all need to take, because you can't afford to pull up on and relax, rest on your laurels and think, oh, everyone's got things under control. It's the constantly evolving threat system, attack surface, and just as the attackers are evolving, so are the defenders. We've heard this before, cat and mouse game. We are making progress through resilience, but that's the part that isn't sexy, okay? And so from a journalist's perspective, the sexy part, as editors know, is the attack, something that either takes something down or threatens to take something down. And hence, over the years, those are the stories that have tended to get more prominence. We can go into that, but I'll stop there to let Dmitri weigh in.
I think, Ellen, you're being a little too generous to some of these folks, to be honest with you, because I feel like some of this hype has started with Y2K. We all remember that transition, year 2000, the world is going to end, right, because we only allocated 2 digits for the year instead of 4. And the clock turned over and nothing happened. Now, and part of it was the preparation that took place and a lot of upgrades. But there were some failures and things didn't end, and we were able to fix it. But I felt like we went from Y2K straight into the cyber 9/11s and cyber Pearl Harbor analogies, and that this digital ecosystem that we're rapidly adopting was making us all so much more vulnerable and is going to be the devastation of our society. And there are real threats, no question about it. I think most of them are in the espionage realm. I really agree with Michael Hayden, the former director of NSA and CIA, who said that we live in the golden age of signals intelligence, largely because of cyber, and the absolute revolution that has had an impact on in terms of collection, both in the national security space and economic espionage, and really the economic warfare that China has been engaged in against us for over 2 decades, is real. The attack stuff is happening, but it's having much less effect, right? And I feel like it got a second wave during Stuxnet, and I remember participating in some of the debates right after Stuxnet was analyzed and understood, where people were saying that this was the blueprint that everyone's going to adopt, that you're going to have factories and industrial control systems everywhere just getting shut down left and right. And of course, none of that happened, because the reality is that this is much, much harder to do than most people understand. And the impact is much more limited and much more fleeting, right? We now understand in retrospect that even Stuxnet, as sophisticated as it was and, probably cost enormous amounts of money and effort to build over the course of years, probably had maybe months-long impact in terms of delaying the Iranian nuclear program. I mean, today they have more enriched uranium, more centrifuges than they ever had, right? So,
meaning the effect was not permanent.
Correct.
And
go ahead.
Well, that's one of the points I've also tried to make. And when I speak, and I did a Cybercom conference, I think last year, where I said part of it, I think what I want to do or have media do is also demystify some of this mythology around cyber. And for instance, Cyber Command. People think, oh, Cyber Command takes something out, disrupts a Russian network, for instance. It takes them. No, it's and they don't pretend it's permanent, right? It's temporary. These effects are temporary. The adversary can and will rebuild their network, but they still feel it's worth doing because it sort of throws some sand in the gears. They call it persistent engagement.
Defend forward, persistent engagement.
All of that.
Yep.
Right. But again, it's to, I think, just keep things in perspective, right? To level set or scope the threat properly, whether it's in cyber offense and attack, or cyber defense, or what a foreign adversary can do in influence operations, for instance, which has a whole nother cottage industry that we sort of engaged in after 2016. But in general, there's a need to really, I think, take. When we're writing stories that involve cyber, think about what the end goal or mission of the action is, right? And how and to what effect that they actually achieve it, and how permanent is it. That's the
well, and the integration is really key, because if you're going to take something down for a very short period of time, maybe hours, maybe even less, then you have to think about what is the value of that. And there is value in terms of traditional kinetic campaigns. So, probably the most successful thing that the Russians had done in the Ukraine war in cyberspace was the Viasat attack. Now, it didn't have permanent effect. It had an effect of maybe days before the Ukrainians were able to bring in other satellite communication systems like Starlink and others to compensate. And it didn't even have complete effect because they still had landlines. They could still send people to communicate. Satellite in many units was a backup. But it had some effect in impeding Ukrainian communications. Now, the problem that the Russians had is that they achieved that effect, which is, a significant tactical victory, but then they couldn't take advantage of that in the military campaign to actually achieve strategic effects. And that is actually really, really hard to pull off, right? That integration of kinetic, cyber, in some cases even the W, very difficult for most militaries, but that's where you really get the benefits of cyber. And cyber in many ways is just like EW, right? When you're jamming a particular signal, you're not just doing it for the heck of it. You're doing it so that, a jet can enter an airspace and neutralize an air defense battery or achieve some other sort of effect. that combined nature is where you get the most benefit.
I want to pull the thread on a handful of issues here because really good stuff. I mean, firstly, EW is nothing new. Churchill, Prime Minister Churchill, referred to it as the Battle of the Beams back in World War II. But it did play a significant role in the outcomes of very significant battles to Europe. And so whereas EW is not new, our dependency upon technology has grown exponentially since World War II. But I want to question, verbiage matters. Our words matter here. I don't think either of you would disagree with the fact that computer network exploit, or the ability to collect information, has grown and will continue to grow. Am I right with that assumption?
Absolutely. And actually, the most impactful things that the Russians have done in this war in Ukraine has not been attack. In fact, most of the attacks have been counterproductive in my view. But the collection that they've been able to gain across Ukrainian military networks and then use that rapidly for tactical advantage on the battlefield, that has literally caused loss of life across Ukrainian military units. That absolutely is a game changer and something that is underappreciated, I think, when the coverage of the Ukrainian conflict is done in the media, or even broader analysis of cyber effects.
And I do want to pull the thread on Ukraine, because I think there was a lot of hype and maybe some overestimating. And quite honestly, I was one of those. I did not think the Ukrainians would have been able to punch back as well as they did. But that came with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, both literally and years of preparation. But I do want to push back on one point. If you can exploit, if your intent is there, granted, it may not have a debilitating effect, but you can also attack, no?
Well, absolutely, you can. The question is for what purpose?
For what purpose? Okay,
and again, like taking down networks, taking down infrastructure is not unhelpful if you're doing in conjunction with something else to achieve some sort of strategic effect, right? There's plenty of like tactical takedowns you can do. So, for example, if you have a covert action against a particular facility, taking down the cameras, for example, for a few minutes while someone jumps the fence, is really important.
Exactly.
But it's important to coordinate that with someone jumping the fence or doing something else. And too often we've seen these cyber attacks that are done in isolation, and the victim rebuilds and moves on, and you haven't achieved anything.
For instance, the most interesting effect of the Stuxnet disruption attack was to, I think, cause confusion and self-doubt amongst the engineers.
And isn't that a potential end state, is to erode trust and undermine confidence?
Yes, but as to Dmitri's point, right, it in the end delayed the development of their program by 6 months, maybe. It doesn't stop it, but it slows it down. What it also did, though, once the word got out, was it prompted a race to develop, for cyber command. So many countries around the world then stood up their own military cyber commands.
Well, it also encouraged the Iranians to invest in their own cyber offense capabilities,
absolutely,
which were non-existent.
And now they're among the top 4, right? Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China.
That probably would have happened anyway.
But it's probably sped it up a little.
All excellent points. And I do want to pull to Ukraine a little bit. And unfortunately, it's still a hot war, and lives are still at risk. But what did we get wrong on that? And I know it's a little early to suggest as much, but I'd be curious, because I do know a lot of U.S. companies. So the cat and mouse game is not in a static environment. They base their actions in part on our actions. And I think it's fair to say the U.S. companies, Ukrainians particularly themselves, did a whole lot to get ready for some of this activity. But I'd be curious what both of you think on that.
As you know, Frank, I've spent a lot of time on this issue. I've been to Ukraine, and I've been focusing on the holistic nature of the conflict. Most of it has not even been on cyber, but on the kinetic part of the conflict. And I think a lot of times in cyber, people don't appreciate resiliency of society, right? These concerns around the grid going down or the water facility going down, et cetera, they tend to think that, well, if that happens, sort of catastrophe, right?
Yeah.
And Ukraine teaches us, and frankly, natural disasters that we see every year in this country, like Hawaii, on Maui, and hurricanes and the like, is that the world doesn't end and that societies are much more resilient. And watching the Ukrainians over the last year or so withstand an incredible campaign, kinetic campaign, missiles, drones, hitting their energy infrastructure, destroying transformers, substations, and yet the grid is still on. And yes, there are outages, but the Ukrainians, even in the midst of a really cold winter, are surviving, not giving up, right? Should be an instructive lesson for everyone in cyber to appreciate that societies are a lot more resilient than you think. And if your phone goes out or even your water utility, you can still manage, right? There's bottled water. There's other things you can do, as we do every single year in this country when a natural disaster hits and people may not have communications because cell towers are down. They may not have access to electricity and the like. We manage. There are generators. There's other ways to do this sort of thing. And too often we don't appreciate the fact that we have backups, right? That we're not solely reliant on these digital systems.
If we invest and think about it. But please, yeah.
I just want to make a point that the Ukrainians themselves will make and have made, and like to stress that two things. One, they didn't just come into this in February of 2022. They had almost 10 years to prepare, going back to at least 2014, right? And to prepare with the help of others. They will say, we had help from partners, from the U.S., from Europe, from NATO, from other countries who shared their expertise, helped train them, shared threat data that they were finding. Cyber Command helped hunt in their networks to look for threat data. And private companies came in and helped the Ukrainians in advance of the invasion with things like helping them move data to the cloud, to back things up to the cloud, so that when their own government systems were disrupted, they actually
But I think it's important not to overestimate the impact of that, because
what we have seen,
what we have seen even in the last few months is that when the Russians really want to take something down, they still can.
Kinetic.
Right.
And through kinetic.
Even through cyberspace, they took down the major telco provider, Kyivstar, just in December.
Right.
What I think we've underestimated significantly, because Ukrainians obviously are hesitant to talk about it, is the impact of espionage. And the Russians have done a lot in the space. They've forward deployed their GRU units in occupied Ukrainian territories to better enable that integration of collection and military combat operations. And that is having real effects. And having spent time with Ukrainian military, Ukrainian intelligence services, I can tell you that they're very, very concerned about the impacts that they're experiencing every single day from that collection. And what they're telling me is that any network that the Russians can get in, including classified networks, by the way, they can. They rarely take them down because of the value of the collection.
That's right.
Exactly. And that's such a key point. We went through sort of a watershed with the stand-up of U.S. Cyber Command and all the subordinate commands to sort of sync up Titles 10, which are military, and Title 50, which are intelligence. Some called for Title 60. I think I might have been one of those. But the reality is to try to get the cyber is an enabler. It's a means to an end. But at the end of the day, it's part of something else. Yes, is that what I'm really hearing?
Yeah, absolutely.
It enhances the
tool.
lethality.
It's a tool.
It's a tool like every other tool on the battlefield. By the way, watching this counteroffensive play out and really fail in Ukraine, it really underscores the importance of combined arms. Right? You can't just rely on any single thing, and too much in the debate around this conflict, there's been a focus on one miracle weapon, whether it's ATACMS, longer-range missiles, or F-16s.
0 day this, 0 day that.
Right?
Exactly.
And the reality is,
which are valuable for collection purposes for a while, but yes.
Right.
But no system, whether it's a weapon system or a cyber weapon, are enough on their own. It's when you bring it all together.
Your nuclear weapon.
Yes.
Actually, that's
and I still remember Jim Lewis saying more than 10, 15 years ago, I don't know, cyber is not an existential weapon. Okay, it's not the one strategic weapon on its own that can.
Hey, I've said that too.
Okay. Well,
but in combination.
Right.
As an enabler to other things, it can be effective. And one thing I would say that is true is that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is not necessarily a blueprint for other conflicts.
And I want to pull that thread.
The China-U.S. conflict would look very, very different, in part because both militaries are using network weapon systems that are more vulnerable to disruption through cyber.
All right, you just illuminated the next question. So what I asked what we got wrong and maybe what we could have thought through a little differently. What is President Xi thinking right now in terms of what he sees playing out in Ukraine, if anything? What lessons could he potentially pull, and how would we differentiate? And I know it's different on so many levels, but how would we sort of put in context Taiwan and the implications for the Taiwanese in terms of what President Xi is seeing play out right now?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the Chinese are actually learning a lot from this conflict because it is a very fundamentally different conflict. The Chinese always had a very negative view of the Russians' capabilities. So just because the Russians are screwing up in Ukraine does not necessarily mean that they think that they're going to screw up in Taiwan. The Ukrainians have had a lot of experience with combat since 2014. The Taiwanese have not had any conflict since the 1950s, right? So they're looking at all of that and appreciating that what they're going to do, which is going to be extremely difficult, probably the most complex military operation in history to orchestrate an invasion of Taiwan. Just was recently in Taiwan, where not only did I meet with all the leadership of the country and the military leadership, but actually walk the terrain. And I highly encourage anyone that's pontificating on this topic to go and do that, because the view that some have, the simplistic view that this is sort of Normandy 2.0, they're going to cross the strait and invade the beaches. That is not reality. Yeah. Those beaches are not invadable because the terrain is just absolutely hellish. You get to the beaches and you're up against a mountain. There's nowhere to go. There's rivers, there's tunnels. This is a natural fortress of an island that is very, very difficult to pull off an invasion. You have to do things differently. I talk in the book about one way that this invasion can succeed. In my book, World on the Brink.
It's coming out soon. We'll have you back again on that.
Yes. But when you think about the China-U.S. conflict, assuming that the U.S. intervenes in that war, we do have fundamental vulnerabilities, and some folks like
CONUS, not just extended, right?
Well, CONUS, yes, although
Within
I'm less
the United
concerned
States.
about CONUS
U.S. assets in the region.
If power goes out in New York City for a few hours, that's not going to impact what we do in the Indo-Pacific.
Tell my kids that.
Yeah, we've had blackouts. People have more babies, right? It's not the end of the world, but ability to impact the system called ALICE, that is a logistical system for the F-35 that can potentially delay the takeoff of these jets from Okinawa or Guam or from aircraft carriers by hours. It's not going to stop it, and we're going to figure it out, but hours can matter.
Hours can matter.
In a conflict
but I
like
do
that.
think that she has taken some lessons away. One is that what Putin flubbed in his invasion of Ukraine was there was no element of strategic surprise. He was telegraphing this thing for months. I mean, in fact, you used to predict back in in October, November 21 that this was coming. I mean, he was massing troops on the border.
We were providing warning. We were literally
yes.
providing warning.
And so she knows, and in the case of Taiwan, he can't do that. Right?
Well, he has. There's no way.
He has to move fast, he has to move faster, and he has to move hard. The other thing
But there will be months-long buildup. There's no way to
but
do that.
they're going to try. They mask it in part through their civilian. They have civil and military fusion so that they can use civilian assets for actual military purposes, like ferries, for one. But the other thing is he's watching. Well, I think one thing that gave him great pause is the degree to which the U.S. and the West joined together and came down hard with sanctions initially, though the sanctions have had now we've seen limited impact. And he's looking very warily at the steps the U.S. is taking with allies and partners now in the region, whether they're Japan, the Philippines, Australia through AUKUS, even India and the Quad, Vietnam and Thailand. And those are the sorts of things that he's having to build into his calculus about whether he can get his military ready and do so before the U.S. really gets everyone on board.
And that it's not an empty victory. I mean, because the economic sets of questions really do differentiate Taiwan from Ukraine.
Oh my God, the economic impact.
So many levels.
That's also, I think, something that would give him pause. He knows that any invasion of
would have
Taiwan
consequences.
Would have
But I want to pull that. But I just want to pull one thread because I think this is such an important discussion, and I'm glad you guys don't see 100% eye to eye on this. That's healthy. What would be some indicators we can expect in that days, months, whatever it is, run up?
This is not going to come out of the blue. I'm 100% convinced of that. This is literally the most complex military operation ever to be put together in history. You're going to need to amass hundreds of thousands of troops, load them up on those ferries and other military equipment. You're going to need to load armored vehicles, blood supplies, ammunition. All of that cannot be done in hiding, in covertly. You're going to see lots and lots of indications of that coming for months. You're going to need to build field camps around the port facilities to house all of these hundreds of thousands of people that you're going to put together. So we're going to see those indications. Now, we may not know the exact.
Already doing some of that to provide some masking?
Not at this scale. And things like blood supplies, was one of the indications that Russia was going, because that's not what you do for exercises, right? And medical equipment and everything else that you're stockpiling. So the difference between an exercise and real invasion is not hard to tell.
I think what concerns the military is that, to Frank's point, there is some masking going on, so that if you see this constant sort of buildup and nothing happens, after a while you don't know, gosh, when are
Which
they
one's
really
legit?
Yeah.
And that actually is a World War II analogy with EW. So the Brits were able to jam German communications to the point that they thought the systems were just not working, like often is the case.
This is where exploit, spying, SIGINT, good intel from the U.S. side comes in handy, and I think that's what's going to really make a difference, right? Is the intel agencies getting information in advance that can tip the allies, the U.S. and allies.
This is a great set of discussions, and obviously none of us are clairvoyants, and we don't know who, what, where, when. But I think
2028.
The drumbeat is. I pulled the thread on that, Dmitri.
Well, no, I was saying this in my book. The scenario is set in late 2028. I do think the window for him to invade opens up then. He's not ready today. But the decision whether he goes or not, and this is really important to understand, depends on really one main factor, which is his appreciation for whether U.S. defends Taiwan or not. Because if he gets confidence, or if he's able to deter us from intervening, then this becomes much, much easier. The Taiwanese cannot hold on, right? They've just not done enough to invest in their own defenses, even though this is a natural fortress of a terrain, to do this. So it all hinges on what is America going to do. A lot of that depends on politics. A lot of it depends on his economic leverage over us. And that's why it's not just a military to military sort of comparison, but the more that he believes he has leverage over us to destroy our economy, to impact the way of life, and to make us think that Taiwan is just not worth it, the easier it is for him to go.
And is that maybe a lesson he's gleaned out of Ukraine?
Yes.
Wait 2 years.
I had a conversation with a senior official in the Pentagon when I asked him that very question, what do you think is the main lesson that China has drawn from Ukraine? And his answer was that we do not fight nuclear powers, that America does not fight nuclear powers. Now, who knows? No one is in his head. It could be lessons that he could be ignoring all of those lessons. He does not strike me as a person that learns a lot from history or is a great has great insights of how to manage geopolitical problems, given all the missteps that he's made over the course of his rule. But it is important to appreciate that we're not fighting Ukraine, of course. And, in this political environment, we are not even passing aid to Ukraine at the moment. So that probably is making the Chinese think that we will not seriously
And aid to Taiwan is in that package as well, by the way.
That's right.
I did not know that. It's actually tied up in that package.
It's Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel.
Yeah. And bringing up, since you brought up Israel and the horrific attacks by Hamas on Israel, What should we expect? What pitter-patter should we expect? We talked about Iran in the past, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are there.
I think that
cyber in particular, as much as we can.
I mean, it's highly likely that there'll be a war with Hezbollah later this year, which will be unlike any war that Israel has fought in a very long time, because Hezbollah has over 150,000 rockets that can touch every part of Israel.
And Lebanese Hezbollah, we're talking here.
Yeah, Lebanese Hezbollah. The Israelis feel like they have to do this because they evacuated almost 100,000 people from the north, which in a country of 10 million people is a lot, right? And these people are living in hotels right now. They're being subsidized by the government, and they feel like that is not sustainable, and they don't see a path to them being able to return safely and not have a repeat of October 7th happening on the northern border. And Hezbollah is even more capable than Hamas in attempting to orchestrate those types of attacks. So they're signaling increasingly to the U.S. that if you do not get Hezbollah to pull back to the river, Litani River in the north, that they will go in. The Biden administration obviously wants to avoid that at all costs, because that will significantly enlarge this conflict and make it much more dangerous. But in cyber in particular...
is it inevitable that it escalates?
I don't think anything is inevitable, and you could still get some deal done. But Amos Hochstein, who I know has been traveling to the region almost weekly, trying to get something done for a couple of months now, and he hasn't succeeded. So it remains to be seen whether they can actually get Hezbollah to withdraw, as was authorized by a UN resolution. But the cyber element, I think, is important here, again, from an espionage perspective. When you look at what Hamas was able to do and the exquisite intelligence they had on Israeli command and control, on the surveillance network that they had around the border fence, right, and knowing how to target that, the critical nodes. They went into some of these bases and knew exactly the server rooms to go into to take out the cameras and other, machine guns that are operated remotely around the border fence to disable that those effects. Some of that was probably human, and there's
human-enabled cyber.
Or just
human in terms of workers from Gaza coming over,
to know where to target,
and so forth. But a lot of it was probably cyber as well. Probably some with the help of Iran to collect that intelligence, and the amount of Hikvision cameras inside Israel.
Back to China.
Chinese cameras is astounding.
Yeah, Ellen.
I just feel like the intelligence failure and security failure in Israel on October 7th was astounding, and just shocking to people in Israel, to the intelligence and military establishment here. We assumed, all thought Israel was impregnable, had this down, they had the highest tech sort of surveillance, and no, this happened. I guess it was just incredibly shocking to hear. And part of it was, they moved a number of security personnel from the Gaza border to the West Bank, anticipating more violence there, and leaving those places, border areas, bases undefended, and
becoming too dependent on technology.
That's the interesting. And if you go back to even some of the early revolutions in Iran, the target wasn't external, it was their internal audience in terms of IRGC and some of the other activities you saw in Tehran.
And by the way, I want to make one more comment. Having spent a lot of time on the Ukraine conflict and looking at the battlefield since day one, the biggest impact on the entire war was 155 millimeter artillery shells and 152 millimeter on the Russian side. It has not been drones. It has not been cyber. It has not been, a lot of these things that people have overhyped. It has been artillery and infantry, the things that have been true since World War I and earlier. And even now with the FPVs that are becoming FPV drones, first-person view drones that are becoming so prevalent on the battlefield, their impact is also quite overhyped, because talking to folks on the front lines on an almost daily basis, as I do, the videos that you see of the conflict of an FPV flying into a tank and destroying it is so cherry-picked, because 9 out of 10 times it fails. And oftentimes it takes numerous drones to get that tank. And where you see that video of the tank being destroyed, it's almost always because it already hit a minefield or was hit by artillery and was already disabled, and the FPV drone is sort of helping to finish it off. And the number of people that are involved in running these drone operations, it's not sort of one person just running it. There's a whole team around it. And the limitations you have on being able to deploy a lot of these drones because of radio interference issues. This is so complex, and the limited payload that you have on these drones compared to artillery. So
they just used one to launch a missile and kill the one of the leaders of Kateb, Hezbollah, right?
Those are different type of drones.
Right,
I'm talking about the small ones.
Yes.
Not sort of the Hellfire missile-equipped ones that we've been using, of course, for 20 years. But we get so enamored with new technology and the revolutionary nature of it. And the reality is that war changes very little.
I want to pull. I do want to pull that thread now, and I'll let you jump.
Okay.
Please go first.
I just want to say, but just pulling back to the idea of unmanned systems, right? I think as technology progresses, I will be interested to see how they're using that. For instance, in the Indo-Pacific, where they're talking about, using unmanned vessels to
submersibles as well. Yeah.
But
can I? Because this is really key. So, if you go back in history, rarely is it the technology itself, but it's how it's applied. And it can have massive tactical effect. But what I think does change the face of conflict today is the surprise element. In other words, you can use an old technology in a new way, or you can use a new technology in an old way that we're not thinking about that can have significant tactical effect, which can have a strategic effect if they think there are 17 more coming down the path. So technology changes, human nature remains consistent. We're going to continue to see that change, but I do think we overestimate sometimes or have some hubris on how some of our other adversaries can use technology. Take the Hermit Empire, take North Korea, and their sophisticated use. And I know CrowdStrike was deeply involved in the initial Sony hack, not necessarily the most but pretty darn sophisticated for a country that, if you see at night, has zero
what
lights
has it
on.
achieved?
That's it. Well, now they've turned to crime.
Theft, absolutely, right?
So they're a state-sponsored crime, and we've had a lot of
funding the missile
discussions
program,
about
the nuclear program with cybercrime, absolutely an incredible effect that they've achieved. Taking out Sony and embarrassing a few Hollywood executives probably was not a strategic win for North Korea.
No, but I still remember you at the time being very impressed by that, and you're saying, hey,
was.
that was the playbook that the Russians then followed.
And it was the hack and leak operation. But in both cases, I think the effect was much more limited than we often think. But just going back to the technology piece, when I look at the UAV developments, it is striking to me how much it is attempting to replicate things that have already existed, right? So whether it's the ISR, the intelligence surveillance reconnaissance capabilities, that's replicating essentially the things you get with global hawks and satellites and the like, or the longer range drones that are basically trying to replicate missils, where you're now putting jet engines on these things, and you were looking and saying, well, what's the difference between that and a Tomahawk? These things are becoming really close in terms of capabilities, or what the Ukrainians are trying to do in the maritime domain, which has been probably their most successful domain, being able to shut off and push back the Black Sea fleet of the Russian Navy. But literally talking to them on this issue, they're saying, well, we're basically trying to replicate the capabilities of a frigate in terms of defense, in terms of offense.
Men and personnel on board that could die.
Correct, but
Exactly.
A lot of these things function like torpedoes, which we've had, of course, since the Civil War. So,
but it is to Ellen's point. There is a difference when it's press a button, and you don't have to put people's
There's
lives.
evolution in these things, like the torpedoes we had during the Civil War were not the torpedoes we have today in terms of the capabilities and
how many
fire
of
and
these
forget.
ISR drones can you build for the cost of one Global Hawk, right?
So the cost is probably the biggest issue, although it's been really interesting. There was just a hack and leak operation against an RGC front company that revealed the cost at which Iran is selling to Russia these Shahed drones that have been pummeling Ukraine, and they've sold thousands of them at the total cost of $1.8 billion that Russia supplied to them in gold, by the way. No one wants rubles, apparently. Not a big shock. But the cost of each of those drones was somewhere in the range of $200,000 to $300,000, a lot higher than most people expected. And when you start putting that together, basically 4 or 5 of these drones is the cost of a Tomahawk missile. And I'd much rather have a Tomahawk missile that is a cruise missile that is much more manipulable and has a bigger warhead than you can put on these Shahed drones. So these things are not simple. And when you start putting EW capabilities on those drones, when you start trying to put bigger payloads, faster engines, you start approaching the cost of a missile. So I think we often underestimate how much effect you can get when you do things really, really cheaply.
Well, think about the Cold War. If you go back, the Soviets would put up 50 birds for our one satellite, and it was sort of a numbers game to some extent. And when we talk China, we lose that numbers game. I don't care how I'm not very good at math, but I'm good enough to figure that one out. And that is part of the equation here.
Quantity has a quality of its own, right?
That's right.
Exactly. And I'm not sure it has to be super capable if the intent is to
so don't get me wrong.
twice.
I'm absolutely in favor of drones. And
I'm not suggesting you're against
and we just have to appreciate their limitations.
Right.
And
Well
this
said.
is not a silver bullet.
Yep.
And that if you want something really, really capable, whether it's an ISR or in loitering munitions or what have you, you start building additional capabilities on them that make the price tag go up dramatically.
Guys, this went in so many directions I wasn't expecting. I love the discussion. What didn't I ask that I should?
No, I just want to say this last remark that Dmitri is just actually sums up sort of what we're all, the theme of our discussion, which is just, don't keep things in perspective, right? We're not totally dismissing the value or worth of a certain platform or weapon or tactic, but keep it in perspective. Don't overhype it or get blinded by its shiny new packaging, and just
kind of like kids soccer, we all
Correct.
swarm that shiny
Correct.
ball.
So, and that's the only way to have a really, I think, reasoned, useful conversation and debate about policy and operations. To me, that's the end goal, right? Whether you're a policymaker, you're a planner, or ops person, or whatever in the military, you want to get the best information, get it sober, get it right. Don't get it, hyped up, so you can make the best decisions possible and plans.
Well said. And articulate it in a sound way as well. That's what often gets lost.
Absolutely.
And technology has unquestionably had a huge effect on warfare. But oftentimes it's not the sexy stuff. It's not the, go hit something and destroy it. It's things like electricity that allows us to operate at nighttime, right? And night vision goggles, and
Tremendous.
intelligence collection that gives us incredible insights in what the other side may be doing. Those are the types of things that have completely revolutionized warfare, but they're not sort of the sexy things you think about. It's logistics. Logistics probably has had the biggest impact from technology, right? And wars are won with logistics, not weapon systems. So those are the things that
Marine Corps adage, and there's a lot of history to show to that.
That we should be focused on, not the sexy stuff of a drone flying into a tank, and we're now saying that tanks are obsolete, which is some of the rhetoric you hear on Twitter, which is ridiculous, or that drones are going to replace artillery. I can tell you from talking to people on the front line that are out of 155 millimeter artillery shells in Ukraine, they're not telling me, send us more drones. They're telling us, send more artillery.
Guys, there's an old adage, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics, but the reality is you guys did bring sound advice to a strategic discussion, which I think it is about perspective. I think all of us can recognize that, and I appreciate all the good work. Dmitri, we'll have you on for your new book. Give it a pitch right now.
World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the 21st Century. It makes the case that we're, I believe, unquestionably in Cold War II with China. That actually has a lot of similarities to Cold War I, and gives the grand strategy sort of blueprint for how we win it.
Ellen, you've done some of the best reporting in the field. I hope we can have you on again soon and keep it up. And to both of you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
For doing this today.